Do you want to pull up Google Translate real quick and pull up Google Translate French to English?
Okay.
And what I want you to do is because the first genre in the 60s is we're covering basically French pop music.
Yep.
And the genre in particular that the first album is from is, I believe it's Yeah Yeah. It's supposed to be like yes, Y-E-Y-E, but I want
Okay.
Josh to say the name of the album, and then I want you to play the Google Translate and see how you did. So, you give a grade.
I don't
So
think
go
I've
ahead.
ever used Google Translate before, actually.
So you got it queued up?
Yeah, I gotta type
Okay.
it. I gotta type it in though. Let's see.
Yeah, so go ahead and type it in. And then after you're done, I'm going to have you type in Y-E-Y-E to make sure that we are using that term correctly soon, too. So, yeah.
Oh, okay. So you can hear the
Mm-hmm.
thing. Okay, so the first album we're talking about is Francois Hardy, Tous les garçons et les filles.
Okay, let's see how you
From
did.
June 30th, 1962. Going that way. Let's see. I did. I would say I did average to below average.
Average. Are you able to take what you learned and make the alterations right now, or no?
It pronounced it tous les garçons et les filles. So
Oh, nice.
yeah,
That
so
sounded prettier.
Yeah. I think I just stressed some syllables or pronounced some of the small syllables wrong.
So we cleaned the stacks right there. That's well
Yeah.
done right there.
Which
Okay.
translates to all the boys and girls, by the way.
All the boys
which
and
is the
girls,
name of
yes.
it. Yep.
And this is
so-
also, by the way, the fifth oldest album that we will cover in the history of the show.
Oh wow, yeah, good pull for that. I guess
Because
one
there
of
were
the
not
early.
many in the 60s, 61, and 62 era that we covered in the show.
No, off the top of my head, it would have been like John Coltrane and some other albums. Like
Miles
that, I think,
Davis.
right? Yeah. Back
The
in
Ray
day.
Charles modern sounds in country and western was older than this. Yep.
Yep. And I guess we haven't covered a French album. Well, that's not true. We covered the Young Gods, right? Were they French
Well,
or were
and-
they
and-
Belgian?
They were French.
Okay.
And we also covered Serge Gainsbourg, who we're going to talk about in a second, History de Mélodie Nelson as well in the 70s, which was a French album. So
Oh yeah, that was a favorite of yours. So what about I know you said that you were going to give a little bit of bio on Francois Hardy so that we know what the context
Yep.
there.
Well, let's use Google Translate one more time. I want you to type in, because we're going to talk about this in a second, type in Y-E-Y-E, because that is the genre that this music comes out of.
Y-E-Y-E. Okay. Is it one word or two?
2 words.
Okay.
Now it is translates to yeah yeah. Okay, it's because
right.
it's supposed to be the French equivalent to American music that American rock and roll that had yeah yeah, right, like as a
Okay.
chorus line. But how does it pronounced in French?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, yeah, yeah. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So basically, it's like the French take on yeah, yeah. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? A little bit more. I don't want to go into stereotypes, but just a little bit more, I guess, just relaxed, right?
So would
Yeah, yeah.
would the yeah yeah yeahs be yeah yeah yeah?
No, I think the yeah, yeah, yeahs though, it's the same concept. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Like a chorus of saying yeah, 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 but which is 50s rock, and of course then the Beatles. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But this is pre-Beatles.
Yeah.
Because it's 62 and the Beatles break in 63, so comes from that. Anyway, Francois Hardy and this whole genre is kind of best understood as the French doing their take of, it's funny because they call it Western music, but to me, France is the West, right? So what
Yeah.
what they're saying here is what American rock and roll was, along with the British who are beginning to be influenced, right? So you don't really have the British invasion at this point. They themselves are exploring it, but whereas they're digging into the blues roots of it, a lot of it, right? The French are looking at the sort of the whole package of the American music, right? And putting like a
Okay.
little bit of a French sensibility on it. So Hardy herself was born in Paris in 1944. So when she released this album, she was all of 18 years old. So she was sort of like what we think of as a young pop star, right? She's the
Yeah.
insert name of any young ingenue. One of the things you learned, because the second album we're going to be covering is the the pairing of this is the self-titled album by Serge Gainsbourg and Jane Birkin. There was a lot of like older men having relationships with much younger women, sometimes in a way that I'm sure would not have been co-signed in the modern era, maybe in other places, but nowadays in this era. And Francois Hardy had that dynamic here, maybe not quite as much as we'll talk about later, but the sort of the yeah movement is a lot of times like older men writing for these younger women with younger ideas, right? Which kind of carries over to this day, because you still see, you know, people in their men in their 30s and 40s writing for female singers.
Is it the idea being that like they're the muses or something in some respect?
Well, I think in like the Serge Gainsbourg case, yes, but I think in this case it's sort of like interpreting the idea of being young and female, or young but with older eyes, right? That idea. We still see that in like movies and stuff to this day, right? Like when you see teen comedies, they're not being written by teens, they're being written by people in their 30s about teens, right? So it's kind of the same idea. But going back to Hardy for a second, she's raised by a single mom, grows up modest means in Paris. She graduates from high school, and she's given a gift, which right away you could tell the age is different from when you graduate from high school in France and America, because in America, you know, where we're doing this podcast, it's 18, but she's releasing this album at 18. And you'll see linearly, she's given a guitar by her absent father, right? As a gift, reluctantly. And she begins to play it, but she is multi-influenced by French chanson, I believe that's the pronunciation, Chanson, which is musicians. The famous ones that I look are like Charles Trenet and Cora Vaucaire, Vaucaire. But then she also, through Radio Luxembourg in Paris, gets to listen to tons of American music, English-speaking American music, most notably people like Elvis, the Everly Brothers, Paul Anka, Connie Francis, stuff like that. So she's getting both of the traditional French music, you know, pop music, but also the 50s American music, early 60s American music. So she's studying political science and Germanic languages, and she ends up answering a newspaper notice for young singers. She fails the first audition, but then she goes to others, and she ends up getting a recording contract at the end of 1961 at the age of 17. Around this time also, she's sort of also being noticed for her looks, and so she's doing some modeling as well at this time. So a lot's happening fast for Miss Hardy. And she ends up leaving university where she was studying to release her first album called Oh Oh Chérie, written by the creative team of another French pop star named Johnny Halliday's creative team. And the flip side of it was the you just did it, Josh, so I'll let you do it again. The name of this album, go ahead and say it for the folks again.
Tous les garçons et les filles.
Yes, and that is the back end of it, which also ends up being track 1 on this album. So it's track 1, and that's the name of the album as well that we're covering today. And this release is kind of well-timed, because this concept of yeah, right? That's how we said it's there, is coming up. Y-E with the apostrophe over the E, Y-E apostrophe over the E for those looking into it. I did listen to some other songs in this genre. I'll talk about it in a little bit. Is being introduced to the country at this point. It's like the new wave in music. And interestingly enough, guess who the pioneer of this music was, Josh? Who is the mastermind of this music?
Serge Gainsbourg.
You got it, my friend. And so it all comes. We did not plan that, but that's how this works. So yes, he is the songwriter who is primarily responsible for this type of music. And to say this was popular, the self-titled track right here, is an understatement because it sold 2 million copies, Josh,
Jeez.
that track alone, in 1962. She also ended up in 1963 taking fifth place for the country of Monaco, which I think is interesting, in the Eurovision Song Contest
Oh, wow.
with a song L'amour c'est en va. I butchered that, I'm sure. French speakers, I apologize. And yeah, she was on Eurovision as well. So, and she is also having a fashion career. She is kind of known as her image is sort of, the way to describe it is like an aloof schoolgirl, like observing what's going on, like an innocence. Part of the yeah yeah movement is these sort of bright-eyed French ingenues, you know what I mean? Sometimes they are sexualized, right? And sometimes they are sort of made to be innocent, but with a little bit, some it's like innocent, but with a, I guess you'd say, a sexualized side, right? Like, I'm not going to say like the Lolita kind of concept, but
Yeah.
like there's more than meets the eye. Others, it's sort of like too innocent for the world, you know what I mean, type. And I think Francois Hardy is sort of looked at as the unattainable, you know what I mean, kind of like
Yeah.
not cold, but sort of like removed from that. That's sort of the image I get, the idea that she is there, kind of like the model. The best way I could describe it is she kind of was like modeled like how Kate Moss, when she
Okay.
was young, was sort of modeled, but maybe not that sterile, kind of, still with a little bit of schoolgirl to it, but sort of that distant
Yeah, a little
concept. Is that,
detachment. Yeah.
yeah, but also the figure, right? She
Yeah.
was. They always keep saying boyish. Now, there's nothing that looks boyish about Francois Hardy. She's
No.
very traditionally feminine, but I think they mean in figure, right? And
I
it's
see.
funny because we would talk Jane Birkin as well, and she was tabbed with this as well, like
Yep.
being boyish in figure. It comes up quite a bit, and I guess from all I could tell is boyish seems to mean not having a large bust
Yeah.
or a large rear end.
Yeah.
Basically, is what they're describing as boyish, because it certainly isn't like looking like a masculine, right? Because these are very feminine women in
Yep.
terms of the traditional definition of femininity. So that's kind of what it is. But she becomes a big enough star throughout the 60s that people like the Beatles and Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan like kind of asked to meet her, and Bob Dylan actually refuses to play a set until she showed up at some point. So
Jeez.
she was there. She also was tied to a photographer named Jean-Marie Perrier, or Perrier, P-E-R-I-E-R, who kind of took her from like shy schoolgirl to like cultural trendsetter. Like a lot of her pictures kind of look like what was going on in swinging London at that time in the 60s and stuff, with a French twist, if you know what I'm talking about. Like, the larger hair, schoolgirl, or urban cosmopolitan, I would say is a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
Yves Saint Laurent, right, as and Chanel, and all of the designers in that era that still exist to this day, right?
Yeah.
She's kind of one of their early fashion icons.
Okay.
So there you go. That's a little bit of what's going on with her.
Background,
Yeah. What'd you think of this one, Josh?
Well, it's interesting going back to the 60s. It's been a while since I've revisited this decade, and yeah, it's interesting that the sound, I would describe the sound as kind of simple and stripped down rock music. I always picture it's her singing on every track. There's no accompanying singers. There's no kind of vocal alterations, and it's a very like simple, like I get the impression of like a simple three-piece like backing, with a guitar and drums and a bass, basically, and not even an electric guitar. It's really, I think, more acoustic, based on what I heard. And it's just her singing these kind of simple rock and roll songs. I definitely, you mentioned the Everly Brothers. I actually noted that when listening to the first track. It kind of has this like early rock and roll, almost like Earth Angel to name a song that reminded me of. And
Little Darlin' was the song I wrote down that it was similar
yeah,
to,
definitely.
Little Darlin', can you
Hmm.
hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, it has that kind of like lilting um, tempo and pace to it when she sings, and they are uh, bouncy at times, the tracks, but they're also often singing. This is a short album too, at 28 minutes, but you get 12 tracks, and a lot of them are about love or kind of uh, broken hearts, and all of those kind of themes that a lot of would appeal to teenagers, I would say. I think there's some hints of what would become surf rock later on, like on the track Le Temps de l'Amour. That guitar part kind of
But
reminded me of that.
can I jump in real quick too?
Yeah, yeah,
Because I listened to the lyric, like I had a translation as I was listening,
yeah.
one of the times, and there is a little bit of a difference in terms of like how they do the lyrics
Okay.
from, because this sounds like music of the 50s and early 60s
Yeah.
in America too.
Hmm.
But in the 50s and 60s, the singer is the narrator, and they're usually writing about themselves or like a friend, like
Okay.
an observation, right, of a friend, like, you got to do I'm talking to you, right, this exact person.
Hmm.
This one's a little like, at times it's sort of like all the men and women, all of them are doing this, the young people. So there's a lot more of like a overall concept of these ideas. Does that make sense? Like,
So
all of the
it's not personalized. It's more like a
sometimes it
mission.
is, but a lot of them are about sort of I'll try to bring up as you continue your review
Hmm.
some examples of that, but at times it's sort of observational more so than direct narrative is something I noticed.
Yeah. It's it's like, I keep coming back to the word simple, and that doesn't mean that's not a pejorative term, but I always picture this type of music, when watching French New Wave films. There's somebody in a cafe playing, and there's like teens dancing, and that's like kind of how I picture this music being
Well,
heard.
well, to give you an idea, the translation of uh, these lyrics, okay?
Hmm.
The first one is like, all boys and girls my age stroll in the street two by two. All boys and girls my age know full well what means to be happy. Eyes gazed in eyes, hands holding hands.
Yeah.
And then it kind of eventually goes like, my days, like my nights, are in every way the same. Without joy and full of boredom, no one whispers I love you in my. So it's a little bit more philosophical approach. You know what I mean? Like, I feel
Yeah.
like the American version of it is like, I look out my window and see that no one's there. I'm so sad. Whereas this is like sort of like wondering about the larger world, right? So
Yeah, and
yeah,
that gets
yeah.
back to what you described her as being more like detached too in some ways. Like it's more observational than personalized. It sounds like, based on how you're describing it.
Yeah, a little more emo or goth, I'd say, a little bit. Like, yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't sound like necessarily. And I didn't get this, hearing the lyrics either. But she's not as emotionally invested. She's more just like describing how it is, or she's not even really sad that she doesn't have a love, for example. But
Perhaps ennui.
yeah. Yeah, but yeah, I found the music, fun to listen to, and a nice change of pace, and definitely reminiscent of that early rock and roll. You're not going to really hear anything that groundbreaking, because this is all foundational music for later stuff that we've listened to. But it it when we get to our comparison, I'll talk a little bit more compared to the other album. But I enjoyed it, and at less than a half hour, it's an easy listen.
Yeah, it's funny that the first like 50s, early 60s rock, which was such a huge genre that
Hmm.
we're going to be covering, is the French version of it. We
Right.
didn't cover any of this stuff in our regular run. So
Yeah,
I
really.
did find that greatly ironic that we're basically doing in the French spin. And so I've never really talked about my relationship with this style of music. I think of this music as being what was the oldies when I was growing up,
Yeah.
right? Which was the
Yeah.
stuff that you would hear on the radio, that like my grandparents would talk about being music they remember from their youth, sort of like when rock and roll moved from being what kind of when pop music became a thing that was in the forefront of culture as
Hmm.
opposed to being something and youthful, right, as opposed to being for all ages, right? I think this was like youth music. And I also think of it like growing up where I grew up, there was a diner culture. And when you would have the jukeboxes at your table, almost all of it would be like 50s and early 60s music, love songs. There's these songs that were relatively simple, but they also always had great hooks that you could sing along with. That, you know, there
Hmm.
were the melancholy ones and the upbeat ones. Some were gimmicky, but this would fall in like the melancholy
Yes.
songs, right? Like
Yes, I
songs
would.
of love and loss. Sentimental would be another
Hmm.
word I'd use for these songs. I really like Francois Hardy's voice. It
Yes.
evokes a lot of emotion, but there is a little bit of her heart may be breaking, but she's not bleeding in the track, right? She's
Hmm.
more just sort of she'll be okay and she will persevere. That's also a thematic thing on this. Like, even though it is not now, there will be a day where this will come true, which thematically was something that you saw in, I think, of the girl groups a lot. That was a
Yeah.
theme that would come up in the, you know, he may not love me now, but he will later, or like I'm gonna leave and gonna find somebody else, or one day I'll find my, true love, stuff like that. So that was a lot of the tracks here. The first track has a killer chorus. It was stuck in my head all week. I said there would just be
That's why it
times where I
sold
was
2 million
doing stuff.
copies.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
and you could see why it sold it because it was definitely a song that when it got to the chorus and then that bass line where it's like dun 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 dun
Hmm.
dun dun, like I kept hearing that bass line in my head over and over again with like behind that the breezy like I can't speak French, so I don't even want to attempt to try to make words that sound like it. So it's almost like humming is what you go like.
Hmm.
It's just like a really pleasant sound. At the risk of sounding like stereotypical American, like the French language, how some people give the English accent like the air of like intellectualism and
Yeah.
stuff. I don't know what it is, but the French language sometimes gives a gravitas to me in matters of the heart. I don't know how to
Mm-hmm.
describe it, but it sounds more profound, even if someone's saying something that if I heard it in just standard English or another language, it would just sound like trite. Like I'm like, oh, that's and the phrasing is kind of there. So it,
Hmm.
it really worked for me, especially because we haven't listened to a lot of music like this. Now, if we went and covered like 60 albums in this genre, I think the ability to differentiate them would get harder because it would kind of sound the same.
Yeah.
But as our first taste at both the French version of this and this type of music, it was a really easy listen. Like you said, it's 28 minutes. My God. And I think is there 14 songs on this album or something like that too? It's got
12.
to be
Yeah.
12. Okay, something along the way. So yeah, 12 at what? 28. That's 220 a piece.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be sitting miserable for any one track if you don't like it. And there aren't a lot of tracks that were real duds on this album, I'd say either. I found all the tracks to be pleasant. Did you find any that were unappealing to you?
No, no, I agree. I think the from track to track it was pretty enjoyable throughout. You're not going to get a lot of deviation. There's a pretty formulaic. There's a formula to the way that they present this music. It's always her singing, and it's always just the four piece. So there's no kind of like variation in that. But it does
Yeah.
harken back to the early 60s American music that you said. Although, and I agree with you, I think her singing, I really like her voice, but it's very measured. You're not going to get a lot of, she's not belting out songs in the way that we would think of somebody emotional being. It's very, kind of even keel in her delivery.
It, it has a little bit of like what the bossa nova music has in it too, doesn't it? I feel like there's a little bit of
Yeah.
overlap there in terms of the way the guitar is played and the
Yes.
singing style. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is, they're not, it's not really, I wouldn't describe this as rock and roll yet. We're not quite there in terms of the tempo or maybe the aggressiveness or even incorporating the electric guitar.
Would you say it's R&B? Like, because in this stage of rock, right, you have
Yeah.
rock and roll, you have R&B, you have blues. I don't consider this to be blues based, really.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, it's almost like when I think of rock and roll, I think of more kind of aggressiveness. I guess this is almost in my mind like proto rock and roll, but it is like
See,
the
I think of
early,
this as rock and roll, but just early rock and roll.
right. But
Yeah.
even like if we're going to compare to like Elvis, I feel like Elvis had, obviously he's more blues based, but he had more of an aggressiveness to him and more of a sexuality to him
But the
than this
bass lines
does.
sound similar to Elvis songs.
Yeah.
That's where I think there is a through line.
Yeah, I guess
like
you're
the
right.
bass lines. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the delivery. I don't know. I feel like there's a gentleness to this, a kind of like just pleasurable kind of, pastoral feel to it in a way that some of other rock and roll doesn't. But
Yeah, it's important to mention too that this is like romantic but not sexual.
yeah,
It definitely is more
it's innocent in a way.
it's
I
it's
would
an
say.
innocent. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
innocent and it's not innocent like later later on they'd be doing in this same genre like songs called like lollipops and stuff and Serge Gainsbourg is in front of that, so you can guess what Lollipops is about, right?
Yeah.
But you don't really have that yet in the genre. Like, not even like winking or subtly nodding as much when I read the lyrics, because I didn't hear it in it, but I wanted to, the second time I listened, to see if it popped up in the lyrics, but it really doesn't. This sort of still continues to stay in the innocent
Yeah.
vein.
And like
So,
you said, the philosophical, I think comes into play as well.
yeah, and track number 5 sort of felt to me like it was in like a detective. It felt like a song, like a detective song, I'd
Yeah.
say. Track 8 could have been on American radio outside of the fact that it was in French. It sounds like a song from like 1959. The only difference being, as you mentioned, the guitar sounds more French or even like South American than it does electric or acoustic guitar in the way that people would be familiar with the sound from there. Track number 9 is a classic late 50s, 60s girl group type of song.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's easily recognizable for anybody of the genre. Those are some of the standout tracks for me. Did any others appeal to you, Josh?
Well, I'll say track 9's J'ai jeté mon cœur, which means I scattered my heart, for those looking for that song. I like the second to last track, Je suis d'accord. That was kind of had a familiar rock and roll rhythm to it that I appreciated. And
It's like a rockabilly riff is
Yep.
in that one.
yep, and even the last track, that was another one that I really liked. C'est à l'amour à quel je pense, which is it's love I think of is the translation, and it's
I was
also
about to say, it's very similar to Spanish. The pense,
Yeah.
pensar is to think in Spanish, and, amor and, amor, same thing. So you can kind of figure out some of it. I knew that was, I think about love or something. Yeah.
yeah, and that again had kind of a familiar quote unquote Western guitar kind of rhythm or chord structure to it.
Oh yeah, this is not going to be familiar to a British or an American listener who may be unfamiliar with French music of the time, but is familiar with 50s and 60s rock and roll, because there's going to be a lot of overlap with it, and and the uniqueness of it, the part that makes it this genre, is a welcome addition for me, at least. So.
Yeah, I'm glad we got to listen to this.
So we will compare at the end, but let's go ahead, and I'm going to give this a thumbs up for me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely. I give it a thumbs up, especially since, like you said, we haven't talked about this early rock and roll, and so filling in and seeing where the French were inspired by. That was interesting.
Yeah, and let's try to guess what Matt would think about this one for those that asked those questions. Do you think where we fall on this one?
I feel like he had to listen to this in school or something for an French assignment, like translate the lyrics or something. I bet he knows this maybe.
Okay.